going to share my screen in just a moment. Okay, so where were we up to? Let me just share my screen. Okay, so I guess we want to go, we finished the Imrei Yaakov, if I'm not mistaken, where we said that even a mumar, there's two opinions as to whether you have to spend your own money to help a mumar, but the latter opinion, the second opinion, is the one that we should generally follow. Okay, so that was what we saw up until now. And let me just see if there's any likuts in here. Okay, no. So let's take a look at a couple of the biurim and see. Bafilu Yisrael balaveros mitzvah lahatzila. This is on page Kuftzari Aleph. Even a Jew who's a sinner is not shomer Torah mitzvahs, is a mitzvah to save him. Isa b'shulchan aruch Yoredei Hilchos Tzedakah Siman Reish Nun Aleph Sif Aleph. So this is in Hilchos Tzedakah, in a section of the Shulchan Aruch, not in Choshen Mishpat, but in Yoredei. Demishu avrayan b'mezid al echas mikol mitzvos hamuas b'Torah v'lo asa tshuva eno chayev lahachyoso v'lo lahalvoso. This was a question that was asked about the UJA yesterday. If someone is a sinner intentionally, even if he violates one mitzvah of the Torah habitually and has not done tshuva, you're not obligated to provide him with sustenance, parnasa, or lend him money. And then the Ramah writes in Sif Beis, the Mikol Makom ein iser bedavar imrotsim lifdoso, rak ein mechuyavin bechach. He writes that there's no prohibition to save this guy. Let's say he gets kidnapped and is being held for ransom. There's no prohibition. If you want to save him, just there's no obligation. But previously, over here in Choshen Mishpat, the Shulchan Aruch had written, the Yisrael bal averos she'eno omed berisho tamid, ela osa averos lahanas atzmo kugon ochel nevelos l'teyavan, that if you have a Jew who is not habitually not against the program, but rather he has lapses, like for example, he'll once in a while stop in to eat non-kosher food. So mitzvah lahatzilo, va'asur lamad al damo. So it is a mitzvah to save him, and you're not allowed to stand idly by and allow him to languish. And it seems like these two piskei halacha contradict each other. The Hilchos Tzedakah pasak the ein chiyuv lahachioso, of a siman kuf nun ches pasak the asur lamad al dama. He says because in the laws of tzedakah, the psak is that you're not mechuyev to sustain him, and yet over here, when it talks about saving his life, you are obligated to save his life. V'chein hiksha b'shut chasam sofer, and Chasam Sofer asked this question as well. Gam nirali tur v'shulchan aruch sosrim zeh et zeh. He says it seems like the Shulchan Aruch itself contradicts itself further. The Masher Kasav b'Yoredei Siman Kuf Nun Ches shepasak kirambam. In Masher Kasav Reish Siman Reish Nun Aleph shepasak keha re'em. I'm not sure if that's the Mizrahi or somebody else. It's Arachin b'chol hanal adkan lashona. And basically, the Chasam Sofer notes the same stira. Aval hadavar pelad lo hirgish tekvar yashvu al meducha zu hataz v'hashach v'tirtzu kush yezeh kol echad lefi darko. But I'm surprised that the Chasam Sofer doesn't realize that both the Taz and the Shach in their commentaries in Shulchan Aruch both raise this contradiction and both resolve it in separate ways. The Hataz Sham, Siman Reish Nun Aleph Sifka and Aleph Kosav Zeloshono, the Ha Yesh Lahakshus Divrei HaRambam Mahadadi, the Kan Kosav Beis Yosef Bishmo B'Mumar L'Teyavam B'Mitzvah Echas Ein Chiyav B'Davar Liftoso. He says, because in Hilchos Tzedakah, the Rambam writes, and this he's just quoting the Taz, just repeating the question. In Hilchos Tzedakah, there's no obligation to redeem him when he's kidnapped. And over here in the laws of of life saving, there is a mitzvah to save his life. So that he quotes the language of the Taz, and he says, he says, so what's the difference according to the Taz? The besimin reish nun aleph the nipsak dein chiyuv lahatzilo, ma'iri b'mumar l'teyavon harbei pe'amim. Ma'she'en came besimin kufim chesh nipsak sheyesh chiyuv lahatzilo hasamari sha'achal nevelos b'ma'at pe'amim. So that it depends on how habitual of a violator of halacha he is. If he does it regularly, so then there's no mitzvah to save his life. If he only does it very seldomly, so then there is a mitzvah to save his life. So that's where he quotes the Taz. I'm just skipping the brackets. Choshen Mishpat simin tav chaf hey sifkat and aleph gamkin hirgish bein hadvarim, and he just quotes the Shach, and he says, Harei dekasav l'chalik bein lahatzilo uvein lifdosa. The Shach sees a difference between a mitzvah to save his life and a mitzvah to ransom him. V'hachiluku kemo shekasav nami harab kan b'siv zeh, the yesh chiluk bein tircha al yedei gufo shezeh mechuyev bo uvein hatzala al yedei mamon shezeh ino chayav. The difference being, how am I exerting myself? If I'm exerting myself physically to save his life, that I'm obligated to do even for a mummer. But if I have to spend money, if I have to use resources, that I'm not obligated to do. And etc., etc., etc. So basically, the whole purpose of this exercise was to show you that there's really no steer in Shulchan Aruch. There's two ways of reconciling the halacha in Hilchos Tzedakah with the halacha over here of saving a person's life. The Taz explains that there's different kinds of mumars. One kind of mumar is the occasional mumar, and the other kind of mumar is the habitual mumar. And that would explain the difference. An occasional mumar you have to attend to, but the habitual mumar you don't have to attend to. Another way of explaining it is like the distinction that the Rav Shulchan Aruch says over here, that even a mummer, you have to save his life. There's just, you don't have to spend your money in order to save his life. And that's where he said there's a machlokes. Some say that even your money you have to spend to help a mummer. Oh, yeah.
It's like being pregnant. Are you a little pregnant or pregnant?
Right. So Mordechai's asking. So that means that mummer is not like being pregnant. You can't be a little pregnant. So the answer is that there's different levels. There's different levels of mummer, according to the Taz. A guy who, every once in a while falls off the wagon, right? So he's an occasional mummer. A guy who's normally Shomer Shabbos, Shomer Kashrus, but when he goes to Aruba, he sees the lobster and he just can't. I don't know, whatever they have in Aruba. Yeah.
So the question is, you need to know the guy because it's still dying and you're not. Okay, let me see. You keep Shabbos, or you have.
That's right. Exactly. Yeah.
And you need three guys.
Yeah. Yeah. So I don't know. I don't know, because remember we said that in today's world, most people, if not everyone, would not fall into the category of a mummer to begin with. They'd fall in the category of a tinok shenishba, and therefore there's a mitzvah to save them. That's what the Chazon Ish wrote, remember. Okay, we're going to skip the next biurim. Let's go on. Okay, we're going to skip the next one as well because it talks again about a mumar who, as we know, is very difficult to find bisman hazeh. What's going to be the bottom line? Well, when it comes to saving someone's life, I mean, you have to do all you can to save someone's life. But you know, the thing that I keep coming back to in my mind is a person needs a huge amount of money to save their life. What is my personal responsibility? So the answer is that if I'm the only person who can save him, then I have to use whatever resources I have at my disposal. But if other people have the same ability to help, because so then it becomes a communal responsibility. Yeah, there is because the stories we've been talking about, you see a guy drowning in the river, you're the only one there, so that's where you have a personal responsibility to save his life. But let's say a guy needs a surgery, and it's going to cost $1 million, so you don't have to shoulder that yourself. You can go and impose upon the community. We all have to chip in together to make sure that this guy his life is saved. Family has to take out a loan, etc., etc., etc. Okay. Tess, v'chol ze b'mumar she'ena omid b'risho tamid, kagon she'ochel nevelos l'teyavam. Continuing this whole discussion, this is only referring to a mumar who is, who has lapses because of his taiva. Like he is, he has this weakness for cheeseburgers or lobster or whatever it is. Kishein lo basar kosher lifamim. When he doesn't have kosher meat, he will get a hold of non-kosher meat. And the same thing is that, whenever his Yetzer Hara gets the best of him, he gives in to his Yetzer Hara. But if a person is stubbornly and continuously going against the Torah, he says the classic example that's given by the Gemara is what's called a roa behema daka, a person who is a shepherd over a small livestock like sheep or goats, and he grazes his sheep in the land of Israel. So the Gemara says that this kind of person has the status of a ganav. Why does he have the status of a ganav? Shahayurov hasados shel Yisrael v'hayumarin osan v'sados shel acherim tamid v'chein kol kayotze bahem. So he says, if a person really is a habitual type of violator of the Torah, where he's involved in an occupation which regularly involves theft, and that's why the example is roa behema daka, because these are people who the Gemara says it's usher to be a roa behema daka in Eretz Yisrael in a situation where you let your animal graze freely in other people's property. He says that's, obviously if you have permission for your animals to graze, there's no problem. But if you let your animals graze and they end up eating other people's grass and other people's crops, so then you're a regular habitual ganav. And for that kind of person, he says, and by the way, that might even apply today. Like if a person is involved in an occupation where they're constantly skimming money off of other people, And there are certain businesses like that. I happen to know that there's certain, even in the frum community, that there are people who set up businesses where they gouge their customers, right? There's gouging, there's onas devarim. Sorry, not onas mamon. Remember, we learned at the very beginning of Imrei Yaakov about ripping people off, either for goods or services, right? Let's say there's a company I know of that they provide a tax service, or they can get you a benefit from the government, but they'll take a huge chunk as a fee, when in reality it's free. It's a free government grant, but they'll file the paperwork for you, and then they'll take like 10% of the money. Well, it depends whether it's gouging or not. In other words, if the compensation is commensurate to the amount worked, so then it's fine. If it's way over the top, where the company is taking or whatever it is, so then it becomes criminal after a while. So the point is, anyway, I don't know the malacha well enough. I'm just giving an example of he says v'chein kol kayotzi bahem. In all of these cases, dinam kenochrim, people who regularly behave in an immoral way in their regular conduct. So then these people have a law of a non-Jew. Look what he says. You're not allowed to save them if you see them in mortal danger. But you're also not allowed to cause them death. You just don't save them. But you are allowed to create a scenario where they are prevented from being saved. And the example that we'll see, we're going to talk about this, is it's a pretty intense statement, is, let's say, the Gemara says a guy falls into a pit, you're allowed to pull out the ladder, even. I don't know if it's talking about this. I think that the next halacha will deal with that, when you're allowed to pull out the ladder. Here, you just don't have an obligation to bring the ladder to him to get him out of the pit. That's, I think, the category that we're dealing with now. So you don't have an obligation to save them, and he says you shouldn't save them because these are bad people. Now, this is, again, it's a shocking halacha, right? So because we're dealing with, you're dealing with someone's life. So how can you not save someone's life?
Because we are a close community, we know each other. But if the guy keeps Shabbos or the guy is a Ghana or not. So, but in case of Bagoi, that you are walking by, you don't know the life of this guy. You don't know what.
Right. So you have to also realize that this is being written at a time when the Goyim are tremendously anti-Semitic, and the assumption is that they have it out for the Jews in general. So there are periods in Jewish history, though, such as the modern period, where there is an obligation to save a non-Jew's life because they comport themselves in a moral fashion, and they are fair to the Jews. Okay, so let's take a look at the Imrei Yaakov just to get clarity on this halacha. Kagon roe behemadaka, like a person who is a shepherd of small animals. So he says, Sheheim pakru begeza, v'holchem be'ivaltam tamid. He says, we're talking about people who basically have completely abandoned the principles of theft, and basically rationalize to themselves that the owners don't mind. The haroa osa avera midayom biyomo v'chol hayom, because he's constantly committing theft every single day. But whereas a guy who eats non-kosher food when he can't get regular kosher food, so he says that's a different category. He says, He says another important distinction is that a person who eats treif is only sinning between himself and God. No one else is affected. But a guy who regularly steals from other people is sinning to his fellow Jew, and that halachically is worse, puts him in a worse category. The dafka baroa behemosov shel atzmo mashenkin baro behema shel chavero ein adam chote velo lo. But this is only talking about a case where a guy is doing this for his own livestock. But if he's hired to do it for someone else's livestock, he does not fall in this category because he's not considered to be sinning for somebody else. He's basically being employed by the other guy, and the other guy has to bear the responsibility. Roe behemadaka dafka baroim hechmir mishum delo psili leidus ela midarabanan v'chachamim asu chizuk ledivreihem kedei sheyitnu leiv lashu. The reason why this example is chosen explains the Imrei Yaakov is because the rabbis recognized that a person who does this is not necessarily a full-fledged ganav, because there is a way to rationalize how some people maybe won't mind if someone grazes on their property, right? Yeah, there's a million other examples. Well, that's the point he's making. He's saying that the rabbis made a special example out of the guy who's the shepherd. The reason why they did so is because that was a prevalent problem in the times when they made this takana. And ubeist in makin va'onshin shalomin haTorah. He says, and that's why the Beis Din would actually take this guy and give him malchus, even though the Torah does not obligate him malchus. Aval gazlanin de oraisa matzilin osam mimaves. He says, but if a person is a biblical gazlan, like he habitually steals from other people, then you do save his life if you see his life in danger. V'yesh omrim, the gam gazlanin de oraisa ein matzilim imhu mushrosh b'cheit ve'ikr chiyusu michyasu mimenu va'avik be'ma'od k'mo roi behimadaka. And some poskim disagree. They say that this is an example of all types of geneva. They say that if a person is a ganav and he regularly steals from his customers and from other people, so then you also don't save him. So this is an interesting machlokes. What if a guy is involved in a business that's not shepherding, but it's another kind of business where he skims off the top and steals from his customers? So then this machlokes is, does this halacha only apply to shepherds, where the rabbis specifically wanted to make an example out of him, or does it apply to all ganavim, to all thieves, I should say? So that's the first qualification of this halacha. In other words, when the halacha sounds very harsh, because it says, don't save this guy's life. You're not allowed to save this guy's life. So the Imrei Yaakov says, Rav Stern points out that they made a special halacha directed only for shepherds because this was such a prevalent problem in the times when this halacha was written. Okay. Yeah, like he's a regular ganaf. A regular ganaf is a guy who tips the scales to his customers, skims off the top. Yeah. Now, dinam kenachrim, they have a halacha like Gentiles. And remember, several months ago, we went through the Meiri. The Meiri's opinion, and he says so explicitly, is that Christians, even in his time, did not have a din of nachrim, of Gentiles in the way that the halacha describes them. Because in France, where the Meiri was living, he felt that the Gentiles that he was living amongst were people who were law-abiding citizens, and that and they were generally observant of the Shiva Mitzvahs B'nai Noach, and therefore you do have a mitzvah to save their lives. So we have to bear this in mind, that if a Gentile is an upstanding human being and is girded, like the way the Imrei phrases it, he's girded in religious principles that keep him as an upstanding moral human being, and he's benevolent to Jews. So then this whole halacha that you don't save a Gentile does not apply to such a person. So again, this is an archaic halacha. It's an outdated halacha that would not apply today. But when we say dinam kenachrim, that these shepherds have the status of a Gentile, Imrei Yaakov says you have to understand, why is there this law that you don't save a Gentile's life? He says, "Vatam de'ein matzilim es hanachrim mishum dahavi kemolid ben la'avodah zarah." It's because you're supporting idolatry. It's like as if you're giving birth to a child. You're adding a new member to an idolatrous cult by letting this person live. Inami bishum dichsiv lo sechane, or because the Torah says, do not give a free gift to an idolater. And that's why the status of a Gentile is, if you're not allowed to do anything active to cause them to die, but you're also not supposed to save them if their life is in trouble. And you can't save them from death, even if they pay you for it. And therefore, even if they pay you as a physician to heal them, you don't do that. Unless there's a concern of anti-Semitism that will be caused by you saving their life, by you failing to help them, right? Because then you can even do it for free. But you're not allowed to cause them death. And he says, Ayin biurim. I refer you to the biurim. Okay, so we'll just take a quick look at the biurim on this last point. I don't think there's really any point on us dwelling for any length of time on the other aspects of this issue. The long biurim deals with what justification are there for shepherds to raise sheep and goats in Eretz Yisrael today. And he ends up coming out that it is permitted when the other landowners or when the government allows you to graze on a particular part of land. So we're not going to get into that today, and we'll deal with the issue of this whole issue of nachrim, life-saving nachrim. We'll continue this tomorrow. Okay. So let us.